So good morning again and welcome. I see everyone's nicely warmed up, lots of good conversations going already. So welcome to the Wilson Center. I'm Roger Mark D'Souza, our Director of Programs on Global Sustainability and Resilience. And we're particularly pleased today to have a conversation on human rights and the environment. How can we do better? I think many of you are familiar with the work that we do at the Wilson Center, and we're quite pleased that this discussion and dialogue today touches on human rights and the environment, because we try to bridge the gap and go across silos in our programming. And most recently, we were voted by the University of Pennsylvania as the #1 think tank globally for transboundary research, transdisciplinary research. So this is very much fits within that area of work for us, and we think that this is really important. Part of what we do here is we tackle global issues through independent research, open dialogue, and actionable ideas. So we serve as the living memorial to President Wilson and really bringing together the worlds of policy and analysis. We're also very grateful to the Henry M. Jackson Foundation based in Seattle, which also serves the legacy of Senator Jackson, who was a champion both on the environmental side and on the human rights side. And this is a very important part of their programming. So we're very grateful for their support, partnership, and engagement. And as we think of the discussion that we are going to have today, I remember just last year when we, just in this room, in this spot where we are standing, when we welcomed Berta Cáceres, who many of you know, is a Goldman Environmental Prize winner from Honduras. And as I think many of you know, Berta was subsequently murdered for her work on environmental rights and being at the forefront of activism in Honduras. And it was quite interesting because as Berta stood in this room and told us about her work, at the same time, on the floor above, on the 6th floor, we had the president of Honduras. So simultaneously at the Wilson Center, we had Berta talking about her work, and we had the president speaking upstairs. And we had folks like you who were running between the two floors and were checking. The president just said this. Berta, what do you think? And it was a fascinating opportunity to really do some validation on the conversation and to get various perspectives. And I think getting into the nuance of these issues and why it's important is very much what will come out in our conversation today. So I'm quite pleased to have a number of colleagues who will help us think about these issues. And as we make these connections, I'm going to ask each of them to just say a few words about their work and how they examine these issues and why they think these issues are important. So we're going to start with my colleague Mustafa Santiago Ali. He's a senior advisor to the EPA Administrator Gina McCarthy on environmental justice. He's also the designated federal official for the A workshop on nationally consistent environmental justice screening approaches of the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, which is a federal advisory committee to the EPA. He's been a national speaker, trainer, and facilitator on social justice and environmental justice issues for the past 17 years, and has worked with communities on both the domestic and international front to secure environmental health and economic justice. So Mustafa, welcome, and I'll hand it over to you.
Okay. Hit this button?
No, it's on.
I'm not good with technology, I'll tell y'all that right now. And I'll warn everybody, I was raised in a family of Baptist and Pentecostal ministers, so if it starts to come out, you know where it's coming from. So I just want to make sure that I've put the proper foundation down before I start. My work is really simple. It's complex, but it's simple. I was raised and came up as a student in the environmental justice movement, so the lens that I look at policy, activities, programs, all those types of things is through a community lens. The majority of my work over the last couple of decades, I'd say 80% of it, has been outside of the Beltway, which I think is extremely important because we have a lot of great thinkers inside of the Beltway. But it's extremely important to make sure that the voices of communities is a driver in a process. And if any of you have ever seen me speak before or know my work, that is my focus. Being raised in the environmental justice movement, there is a term that says communities speak for themselves. So I think that it's always extremely important that we make sure, one, that we honor that, and that is a driver in the process. And the work of environmental justice at the Environmental Protection Agency, for those of you who may not know the history of how that actually got started, it actually came out of a set of recommendations from stakeholders saying that there should be an Office of Environmental Justice because of the disproportionate impacts that were happening across the country in communities of color, in low-income communities, and in tribal communities as well. And because of those sets of recommendations, many of the most successful programs that the agency has been able to move forward on, and a number of the activities have come out of those sets of recommendations, which are a guide for me in the work that I do. So the Office of Environmental Justice, which started off as the Office of Environmental Equity in the early 90s, came from a set of recommendations. The National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, which was just mentioned, came out of a set of recommendations from stakeholders saying that there needed to be a federal FACA body that could provide advice and recommendations to the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency to make sure that as they were moving forward on various policies, programs, those types of things, that the voice of communities would help to guide and mold that. Executive Order 12898 that President Clinton signed in 1994, some folks label it as the Environmental Justice Executive Order, which created the Interagency Working Group for Environmental Justice, which is another part of my portfolio, came out of a set of recommendations from stakeholders saying that we have to take a holistic approach to addressing the issues that are happening inside of communities. So there are 17 federal agencies and a couple of White House offices who have a distinct responsibility. And let me repeat that. They have a distinct responsibility for the issues of environmental justice. If you know folks who work on environmental justice issues, we often talk about taking a holistic approach. And many of you in the room have a great understanding of that. That means that the Department of Transportation or transportation issues, when we talk about transportation justice, those are a part of the paradigm of environmental justice. When we talk about housing justice issues, and that means that HUD has a responsibility in this space as well. When we talk about public health justice or health justice, that means that HHS has a responsibility in this space. When we talk about the creation of good jobs, clean jobs, green jobs, then the Department of Commerce and the Department of Labor have a distinct responsibility in this space. And they have to actually create environmental justice strategies, which you all can go and take a look at, but they also have to have annual accomplishments reports. And that gives people an opportunity to take a look at how they are approaching these issues. So I, in my work, try to do a few things. One, I try to make the linkages and often be in spaces where community folks haven't yet been able to get to. But what I really try and do is make sure that community folks, the folks who are actually on the ground doing the work, are in those conversations. And when they can't be, then I make sure that I'm there, and I try to the best of my ability, even though I can't speak for every community, I try to make sure that folks realize the need, the opportunity, and how it is a valued added proposition by making sure that environmental justice is a part of their planning, their processes, and the movements going forward. And I've been trying to do that for the last couple of decades, along with the youth work that I do, honoring where I came from and trying to create additional new spaces so that the voices of youth can be a driver in the innovation that's going to be necessary for us to address environmental justice, to address climate justice, to address climate change, and sustainability and equitable development. So I can talk for a while, but I'm going to stop there and allow my colleagues to move forward, and I look forward to our conversation today.
Great. Thank you very much, Mustafa. So, Mustafa, you talk about this transition from thinking of environmental equity to environmental justice. Deconstruct that a little for us. What's that about, and what is the evolution there?
Yeah, that's a deep one, and it's a good one, too. So there were three terms when the movement first started. So many of you know Warren County, North Carolina was sort of the flashpoint, if you will, for environmental At that time, environmental equity, let me stop, three terms: environmental equity, environmental racism, and environmental justice. Those were the three terms at that time that were used by various groups in defining some of the impacts that were happening inside of communities. So early on in the movement, there were conversations among stakeholders and others about how we would label things moving forward. So we started off with environmental equity. And at one of the conferences, there was an older lady who was there, and her response to that was, well, equity, does that mean that we're just moving pollution and impacts around from community to community? And she said at that time, well, what we really want is justice. So then the term environmental justice started to come into use. But there's also another term that many stakeholders use, which is that of environmental racism, because they feel that there is a more significant disproportionate impact in communities of color than other communities. I, being raised in Appalachia, have also seen huge impacts also in low-income communities, in many instances low-income white communities. So I want to make sure that we understand that the impacts that are definitely happening in communities of color also happen in low-income white communities. And I believe in something called real talk. And everybody know what real talk is? Mm-hmm. So I think that it's extremely important, if we're going to have real talk, to also realize that for some folks, if you can't see yourself in a situation, if you can't see your Aunt May or your Uncle Jim being impacted by something, then it may not be able to make that connection there. So that's why I think it's extremely important that we understand the fullness of the impacts that are happening, but also the opportunities that exist in this space. So going back to the initial question, those are sort of the three terms that folks have used over the years. Now pretty much folks are talking about environmental justice, but when you hear those three terms now, hopefully you'll have an understanding that they are interconnected and different groups have used them at different points in time.
So to build on that, how is this a human rights issue? Real talk.
Yeah. How is it not a human rights issue? Let me do this for everybody. Everybody do me a favor. Take a deep breath and hold it. Now let it out. I don't want anybody passing out. I want you to think about this. How important is that breath of clean, fresh air? See, I'm a country boy, so I believe in keeping things simple. I know sometimes in Washington we like to put all these formulas and, complexities to issues. As a human rights issue, if you don't have fresh air to breathe, you can die, right? If it's polluted enough, or you shorten your lifespan. So for me, keeping it simple, if you don't have clean air, which many communities, a number of communities, communities of color, low-income communities, and tribal communities struggle every day with that fact. Many of us are blessed that we don't have that situation we have to deal with on a daily basis. By a show of hands, how many folks in the room have actually had a glass of fresh water in the last 24 hours? Everybody look around. So we're blessed to be able to have that. But there are still communities who struggle, both domestically and internationally, to be able to have that. So for me, those are basic human rights, because if you don't have those, you don't have life, or life is shortened. So there's no need to sort of make this more complex than it actually is. These are basic components of life. And of course, the other one is the ability to have fresh and healthy food, because we know those are the three pillars, really. The three pillars are air, water, and land. And as I say land, I'm talking about, having the opportunity to access healthy and safe food. So for me, those are human rights. Now, some other folks may try and debate those issues, but I always say take one of those out of the equation, and how does it impact your life? So for me, it's that simple.
Great. Thank you, Mustafa. That was great. Real talk. So we're going to continue in this real talk with Maxine Burkett, who's a professor at the William S. Richardson School of Law. She teaches climate change law and policy, torts, ocean and coastal law, and international environmental law. She's written extensively on various areas of climate law, with a particular focus on climate justice, looking at the disparate impact of climate change on vulnerable communities in the United States and globally. She serves on the boards of Global Green Grants Fund and Kanu Hawaii, and is a member scholar for the Center for Progressive Reform. So, Maxine, I know that you are working on a set of issues related to this that are very salient now, that are getting a lot of attention. So tell us a little bit more about your focus right now.
I will. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I should warn all of you that the jet lag has been particularly aggressive this time around, and it's about 4:30 in the morning for me, so this may all actually be a dream, which I'm happy to have you all in. But yeah, there's a lot of threads I'd like to pick up on, but I want to talk specifically about climate change, induced displacement, and migration. Particularly relevant, I live in Hawaii, and our Pacific Island neighbors in particular are the front lines of this. And these are communities that haven't had sort of the advantages, the greatest advantages historically. And so it's really relevant for us as we're thinking about rights. But what I'm going to talk about, because there are a number of very complex issues that are related to climate-induced migration, I'll focus on one element that relates to today's topic, but it describes three interwoven concerns, and I'll try to do this in 5 minutes. It's the naming and the importance of naming and legal nomenclature with respect to human rights. So the three concerns are who are we talking about, who exactly are we talking about, who are gonna benefit from rights claims, what are the duties that match those rights claims based on climate change specifically, and what about the trigger? What about naming it climate change itself? Why give it the name? How is this different from other kinds of migrations that we're seeing or we have seen historically? How do we understand those that are seeking a better life in the face of significant threats to their livelihoods, but that trigger being climate change? So those are sort of three major questions about how we name a particular phenomenon, category, et cetera. I'm starting with this image about the Nansen Initiative, because this is an initiative that was sort of a state-led. Switzerland and Norway launched it in October 2012, and it was in response to the fact that the international community has not been able to come up with a sufficient response to this emerging phenomenon of climate change impacts inducing migration or displacement of peoples. And so they were looking to develop a protection agenda for those who cross borders. Most of the migration, by the way, that's going to happen as a result of climate change happens internally within countries. But the harder questions in some cases are those people who must move across borders because of international law regimes. But they initiated this effort, Switzerland and Norway, because this kind of migration falls outside, the environmental migration falls outside of more traditional protection regimes like the Refugee Treaty. And that's important because legal definitions bind states in ways that descriptive labels cannot. What we mean by that is that although we have probably heard the term climate refugee used both to describe people that are moving globally, whether it's in South Asia or in the Pacific, or to describe United States citizens that move as a result of a storm, like Katrina, the term was used quite controversially, or now we're seeing media on climate refugees with respect to the Biloxi Chitimacha Choctaw tribe in Louisiana. These are terms that we understand sort of as a political matter, as a sociological matter, but legally it has no significance, and that matters for a number of reasons. Without the right name, or legal nomenclature, the rights of those within country and especially those in foreign countries, their status rights are uncertain. And that in and of itself is a rights failure, if you will. The importance of nomenclature in advancing human rights is significant. Who are we talking about? How capacious and nuanced is the category of people we're talking about? In other words, does climate change impact happen to an individual or to a community? Human rights are based on individual appeals to somebody, almost always states in the formal human rights infrastructure. But do we craft rights for you or me or for all of us? And that's a different orientation. The dominant paradigm suggests that it's you or me, that, and actually builds disaster recovery policy around that individual identity. But in fact, we're seeing that appeals to relocate, for example, again, even if just using our domestic examples of Alaska Natives or tribes in Washington State or in Louisiana, they embody the latter kind, right? All of us, we must move. And how do we sort of bridge between our two conceptions of it? And individual appeals, by the way, based solely on individual rights, may also impact informally or loosely formed communities that are often disproportionately Black and brown. Now, regarding the naming of the duties themselves, what are the environmental duties that one would have if you're appealing to a human rights argument? And this goes back to a concept that I just think was brilliant and incredibly prescient. Professor David Caron in 1990 wrote this article called The Problem of Legal Feedback Mechanisms. Some of you, I can tell, were not even born by 1990. Professor Caron was writing about the impacts of the law and its failings with respect to climate change in 1990, and it was with respect to issues I'll set aside for now around the law of the sea and baselines. But he was essentially borrowing the sort of notion that there are positive feedback loops in our understanding of climate science, and certain events accelerate climate change itself. He was actually saying certain elements of our laws, or absence of law that are relevant, actually accelerate the impacts of climate change. So he said legal feedbacks will not alter the amount of climate change, but will aggravate the suffering that will accompany such change. The greater the change, the greater the aggravation. Now, it was 1990, so he didn't have the benefit of the Framework Convention or Kyoto, because in fact, I would argue that legal feedbacks have altered the amount of climate change. Our failure to have a rigorous climate policy, climate laws, has actually made climate change more of a serious and near-term crisis. But certainly the things that we do in response or fail to do in response, the rights that we appeal to or fail to develop, will also aggravate the experience of climate change. And one of the issues is that we haven't articulated sufficiently, and maybe we can do this today, what we mean by environmental duties. In other words, rights mean something if they oblige others to do something in response to them, right? But we haven't actually identified what it means to have a duty to meet those rights. And that's a huge gap. And it was noted actually very recently, fall 2015, the Journal of Human Rights and Environment, the editors, Voigt and Grant, noted that there's precious little jurisprudence on the environmental duties of states corresponding to or complementing human rights. There is as yet no theory on how environmental rights may be related to environmental duties. So what do we mean? What are we asking the others to do in order to meet our rights? This is a yawning gap in our conversations. It's the case generally, and it's certainly the case relevant to the specific issues of displacement. And now my last slide. One of my favorite New Yorker cartoons from Sidney Harris. This is one of his most famous, right? So you've got a problem here. But we solve it because there's some miracle that occurs, right? And the issue is that we need to actually be more explicit in this, in our steps in this regard. And that's to me, in this context, naming the trigger for this migration. So using this as an example, there's a tendency in the what do we do question and the discourse on climate change related migration to clump climate change as a driver of displacement with other non-climate based drivers. So in other words, people will say, well, okay, there's climate change impacts that are happening that might be driving migration, but earthquakes, tsunamis, poverty also drive migration. And that's, in effect, a way to have this kind of displacement fit within the same norms and instruments that you would use to apply to other kinds of migration. And indeed, this is what the Nansen Initiative did when it combined responses to disasters and climate. Initially, it had been just about climate, but then it was saying, well, this is not all that different from just disasters generally, so let's just deal with both of those in the same type of protection agenda. But the entangling of those drivers suggests that the difference between the triggers for migration is trivial or maybe, and more likely, too difficult to parse. And in fact, what is paramount, I think they would argue, is to meet the needs of those that are migrating by assigning and allowing them to exercise their rights, never mind why they had to move. And that's profoundly convincing on the surface. I think, however, it is important to consider that being more specific in naming the trigger here is essential, because it allows us to understand that climate change is not a random, faultless act of God, but something other. Indeed, numerous principles within the Framework Convention understand and reflect that something other, like the common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. And the rights and reciprocal obligations that we craft would do well by us, all of us, by also reflecting that something other. So if we remove these rights, the climate justice arguments from our discussion upstream on climate displacement, we're sort of sanitizing or scrubbing our solutions downstream of significant rights language that would be more reparative than simply accommodating. In the absence of that kind of downstream community level rights-based solution making risks perpetuating the initial inequity of anthropogenic climate change. And that's evidenced today in 2016 by what we're seeing over and over again, this very familiar and similarly disproportionate impact of climate change on those that are hit first and worst. Thanks. I look forward to discussion. I look forward to your question first, which I'm sure is forthcoming.
All right, Mustafa, I think you set this up. Real talk. All right, so Maxine,
Yes.
I think give us a lot of food for thought. You know, in whose interest are we acting? You know, what's the legal feedback loops? What do we mean by environmental duties? So you talk a lot about the legal framework and why that is important, and duty bearers and action to be taken. And I reflect on a discussion that we had here at the Wilson Center last week that was looking at the ethics of climate change. So my question for you is, as you work on the set of issues that you are working on, and you're talking about the legal framework, is there room for morality in that discussion? Do the ethics come in to that discussion? And if so, how?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a number of ways to tackle that question. I think the obvious, sort of intuitive answer I think we'd all have is, of course, the ethics have to come into it. In fact, the law is supposed to be sort of the walking, talking demonstration of our ethics, of our sort of public values that we've sort of reached by consensus. The problem, I think, is that in the actual law creation and law adjudication, there are a lot of other sort of factors that influence the end result. So I think if we were to sort of be behind a veil, if you will, and we presented the facts and we said, well, there are a set of communities that were burning fossil fuels for the last century, and walk it through, and now we have Pacific Islanders who'd previously been bombed by various countries, have nuclear waste, et cetera, vulnerabilities. They're now forced to move. What do we do about that? What's the right answer? How do ethics guide us on this? You probably wouldn't respond with, well, migration is kind of an adaptation response. Relocating is probably going to happen, so why not sort of beef up labor agreements that we currently have to respond to that? And it benefits both communities. This is a sort of a viable solution. In other words, what I'm saying is that the solutions that we're even seeing suggest that the ethics are being disproportionately impacted by sort of the political possibilities versus the right. What is the right way to go with this, and how human rights would direct us, more or less. So I would say there are a number of ways to tackle that question, but I would say ethics are relevant, but they're not necessarily playing out.
Right, and it's not an either or, certainly. Yeah.
No, I don't think it's an either or. I think you can have both, but I do think the tendency is to not incorporate it as clearly and carefully as we could.
Okay. So as you started your comments a little while ago, you started by saying that you wanted to take up on a few points that Mustafa had made. What did you want to react to?
There are a number of things, but I would just take the one with respect to how we name the phenomenon of environmental justice, equity, and racism, and I think that's a very important consideration as well. Justice actually pushes us to better possibilities. I always say you want to aim for the justice unicorn, right? And not have lessened opportunities. I mean, what was so brilliant and excellent about the environmental justice ethic was this notion that nobody's community deserves to have this, and if it starts with us, first and worst, it will end up in your backyard as well, or in your front yard. So it's a very critical gatekeeping that could happen if we were to actually take the environmental justice ethic and apply it at large.
Great, thank you very much. So many of our partners and colleagues and collaborators are doing conservation work internationally. So we're particularly pleased to have Teresa Burpert with us. She's the Director of Social Policy and Practice at Conservation International, and she helps advance CI's human rights approach to conservation. She promotes the integration of human rights in conservation action through the development of institutional social policies that guides CI's work, through the engagement in key policy arenas affecting communities tied to access and benefit sharing, tied to the Convention on Biological Diversity. And Teresa has spent a lot of time working in partnership with Indigenous peoples and local communities around the world. So Teresa, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thanks Roger, Mark, and thanks to everyone and especially to the Wilson Center for hosting this discussion today. As Roger Marks said, my name is Teresa Bupert, and I'm the Director of Rights, Governance, and Social Policy at Conservation International. For those of you who aren't familiar with CI, we are an international organization that has worked for just shy of 30 years on conserving biological diversity. We also, as an organization, believe that people need nature to thrive. So our mission, as it currently stands, also contains a specific component focused on improving human well-being. So adding to what's already been said today by Mustafa and Maxine, I just want to focus my comments on some of the work that CI does related to indigenous peoples and human rights, and particularly in the climate change context. This is an area that CI has worked on for a number of years, and we have numerous examples that I'll share with everyone in the question and answer period that demonstrate ways forward of how to respect indigenous rights, indigenous people's rights in the climate context. And I should preface this all by saying that CI, as you can probably tell by our name, we work internationally. So we've had some great discussions on some of the national components and touched on the international components, but CI does work primarily in that international space. So that's when we talk about indigenous peoples, we're thinking about it in the international arena. So, but right now in this brief introduction, I also want to just lay the groundwork, give you the foundation for why and how CI thinks about indigenous rights and all human rights, in fact. And I think this is an important foundation that is not only for CI, not only for Conservation International, but also for other conservation organizations that are doing similar work. So as a result of, Mustafa shed some light on what drove the environmental justice conversation here domestically, and I think also in the international community and working with indigenous rights and conservation, what drove that conversation about indigenous rights was in the early 2000s, sort of a backlash against conservation about and allegations that the conservation community was not protecting indigenous rights. And in fact, they were maybe speaking for indigenous peoples and maybe taking advantage of indigenous peoples. So that was an important conversation to be had, and I think it helped drive conservation organizations to really demonstrate what exactly they were doing, how their work with indigenous peoples looks, and what are the outcomes of it. As part of that discussion, too, we at CI, along with 7 other conservation organizations, big environmental organizations that work at the international level, decided to come together in a consortium called the Conservation Initiative on Human Rights to focus specifically on this issue. Because we had different experiences, but we all worked in the same arena, and we thought there was a lot of lessons that we could learn from each other, and we could collectively help drive this conversation on respecting indigenous rights and conservation. I forgot I had some slides. So what we've done is we all came together and as this collective decided that to advance the conversation on indigenous rights, we needed to establish rights-based approaches to conservation. And this is a human rights-based approach, so not to be confused with something else. And at CI, what that means is ensuring that human rights, including indigenous rights, are respected in all of the work that we do. So you might question, and this is a question that this coalition, this consortium got a lot, like, well, why rights? Why are we thinking about rights? We're a conservation organization. We focus on biodiversity. We focus on plants and animals. What is this about rights? Well, I've put a few headlines up here, and I think these are all pulled from the internet, some more recently, some a little bit older, but they all they're illustrative. They show that the first one, upholding human rights and conservation, who is responsible? It gets back to that duty bearer question. What role does a conservation organization have? We're not the state actor, but certainly we have some obligation, and we certainly have an obligation to our mission, which is directly connected to human well-being. You also see climate change will affect women more severely than men. This is an important consideration, recognizing that the impacts of climate change they're unique to different sectors, right? They're unique to women, they're unique to men, they're unique to indigenous peoples, indigenous men, indigenous women. Everybody is impacted differently. And then you also have this final headline, forest groups want climate schemes that violate rights to be suspended. So the reason why I highlighted these headlines is to demonstrate that even though we sometimes might assume that conservation is largely focused on biodiversity or conservation is focused on plants and animals, that the human rights might not have much to do, well, in fact, they do. They are part and parcel of what we're doing. And even though we might like to think that we've gone beyond this conversation, you can see by the dates on some of these that we're still in this. We still need to actively work to protect human rights in our conservation work. So some of the rights that come into play for us are like the right to participate in decisions that impact decisions that impact individuals or communities, the right to water, the right to own land, the right to a clean environment. These are all the kinds of rights that we think about in the conservation context and in the climate change context. So this consortium that we came together with the other conservation organizations, we collectively identified a set of 4 principles that help us as conservation organizations, help us guide our work on human rights. And then each independent organization went about putting together the other parts and the other pieces of that puzzle. What do we need institutionally to create the conceptual infrastructure that will help us work on these questions? Well, at CI, we determined that we need policies, and we developed a set of 6 rights-based approach policies. And among these 6, there are a few that I'll just highlight. One is on indigenous peoples, and in that policy that guides our collaborations with indigenous peoples, one particular component stands out, and that is the respect for free, prior, and informed consent. For those of you who are familiar with indigenous rights, this is an important right for indigenous peoples. It's an evolving right, and it is, in the conservation context, we deal with it daily. Another policy that we developed that is particularly important to this conversation is a policy on gender integration, the policy to ensure that men and women benefit from conservation equally, and that we work toward equity principles in our collaborations with these groups. We also have a policy on vulnerable populations that kind of connects all of these together. So these policies, a policy can only, sometimes is only as good as the paper it's written on, right? We need to go beyond that. So we also developed a set of guidelines and tools, 2 that I'll mention that are very important, that help us really bring that policy to life, that help us actually respect rights in practice. One are guidelines on applying free, prior, and informed consent in the conservation context, and another set of guidelines on how to integrate gender into our conservation work. So those are 2 that stand out as very important in advancing a rights-based approach. So finally, in thinking about the other components of this conceptual infrastructure, these structures that we need to get this job done, we have the practice, and that's the implementation part, and that we have case studies, we have examples, we have demonstrations that help us show how we actually do this in practice, and we have to continually learn from them because they're not all successful. There are definitely learning moments, but these are an important way that we, as a conservation organization, advance this discussion. Oh, whoops. There you go, the other way. There we go. So I've talked a bit about how we do this institutionally. We build the structures, right? The foundation that helps us drive this conversation. We also have to do this at the local level, and this is a picture from a project that CI Liberia is working on, and these are the local stakeholders, and they're discussing stakeholder engagement. And we also have to do this from everywhere between that local level all the way up to the United Nations climate change arena. And so we can't just advance our conversation on respecting Indigenous rights in one part of that. We have to look at the breadth of our work and ensure that we are indeed respecting rights throughout. So I'll stop there. That's just a bit about the foundation that CI and other conservation organizations similarly use to help promote and to help respect Indigenous rights in the climate context.
Great. Thank you, Teresa, and congratulations. It's very impressive to see a large conservation organization like CI very much focusing on a rights perspective to your work. So I want to keep in the context of real talk, otherwise Mustafa might smack me. So just to keep it real. So, you know, when we hear some of the voices from indigenous populations, and this gets back to Mustafa's point about the voice of communities, right? Some of the literature that I have read, and forgive me if my knowledge is incomplete, but some of what we hear from indigenous communities is a fear of being sucked up by this international indigenous movement. And there's a fear at times of losing the local specificity and context and empowerment at that level. And it's a tricky space to operate in. And I wonder for you as an international conservation organization, how do you navigate that space? How do you ensure that it really is the authentic voice of the indigenous partners that you are working with, that you are really learning from them, that they are really empowered? Talk a little bit about how you manage that space, because it's not easy. I mean, I was surprised Mustafa said my work is simple. I think it's simple in focus, which is what I get, but the implementation is tricky, and you guys have to navigate some of that. Talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah. No, I think that's a fair comment that there is the potential to just get wrapped up at this very international level and to be having this conversation up there and maybe think that everybody's speaking the same language, but then when you come down to a local level, it doesn't resonate at all, and it's maybe not representative at all of the concerns on the ground. So I think there are two things that Conservation International in particular does to make sure that there is that connection between what's happening on the ground, the very local level, and what's happening in those international conversations in the climate arena. And one is we have an Indigenous Leaders Conservation Fellowship. And this is an opportunity to recognize Indigenous local leaders who have an idea. And they have an idea related to advancing their traditional knowledge, researching their traditional knowledge related to biodiversity, related to climate change, so that their research can then serve a greater purpose. And it can feed back into these higher level discussions. So I believe it's since 2009 or 2010, forgive me, this fellowship has been ongoing. There have been close to 15 fellows that have participated, and I think that we have real results connecting those dots. One individual in particular, Hindu Ibrahim, she is she is from Chad, and she researched how climate change is affecting the area around Lake Chad, looking specifically at how traditional knowledge can help in the adaptation to climate change. That was a couple of years ago. Using that as a launching point, most recently was invited to speak as an Indigenous representative at the signing ceremony for the Paris Agreement. So it's a huge accomplishment, and it's important for us and for Hindu, for people like her, to make those connections between what they're experiencing on the ground and how they can take that and use that most effectively in that international arena. One other example I'll share is that CI also has an Indigenous advisory group. This is comprised of 5 individuals who are experts, Indigenous representatives who are experts in climate change and rights, and they provide feedback to the organization on our climate policy positions and our projects, and that's also an opportunity to ground what we're talking about at that higher level and make sure that it is in fact having the impact that we want it to have.
Thank you. So I also wanted to ask you another question, which I think is a difficult question because I reflect back on Berta being in this room talking on these issues. So Global Witness just released a new report, and they've documented that 185 environmental activists were killed in 2015, which represents a 66% increase from 2014. Brazil was hit worse with 50 deaths. The Philippines had 33 deaths. More than 200 environmental activists were killed in Brazil between 2010 and 2015. Almost 40% of the 2015 victims were indigenous people. So these are really people who are at the forefront. Their lives are on the line, not just in terms of the way that Mustafa talked about it. Their lives are at risk. Talk a little bit about that from CI's perspective, because this is critical work. It's important from a rights perspective. It's important from a conservation perspective. It is really a life and death issue. How are you able to navigate in that space? Because for me, if I were actively working in this space, I think this is a huge responsibility. You are literally taking people's lives into your hand. Is this, how do you, maneuver that space?
Yeah, it's extremely difficult, and the possible outcomes are devastating. I think one thing that...
Maybe just speaking to the mic a little bit.
Pardon me.
Thanks.
I think one thing that an organization like Conservation International can do, and that we do, is act as a convener. And we have the ability, we have partnerships with a lot of different entities. We partner with the government, we partner with the private sector, we partner with big business, we partner with indigenous communities, we partner with a variety of diverse groups. And what we can do is we have the ability to bring all of these diverse groups together for a dialogue, much like the Wilson Center aims to do. And I think that is one way that we can help to have those difficult conversations and hopefully mitigate any of those other outcomes.
Okay, and sort of bringing the visibility to it. I think this visibility and awareness raising is an important part of what partners like Green 2.0 and the Raven Group does. So I'm really excited to have Whitney Tome with us. She's the Executive Director of Green 2.0 and Counsel to the Raven Group, has worked on several environmental issues from oceans and fisheries to national parks. She's passionate about our planet, its resources, and the people who will live on it, the people who live on it now and people who will live on it for years to come, and has worked on several political campaigns at Environmental Defense Fund's Oceans Program, and has built partnerships with universities, and has worked, and this is interesting, to establish clear and measurable diversity metrics for National Parks Conservation Association. So Whitney, let's hear a little bit more about your work.
Thank you so much. So first of all, delighted to be here and delighted to be on this illustrious panel. I'm sitting here feverishly taking notes, thinking, all right, what do I do next? So Green 2.0 is largely focused in the US context, but I think it's applicable across the international space, like Teresa said. And Green 2.0 really has a singular focus mission, which is to increase the racial diversity of the mainstream environmental movement. Let that sink in. Increase the racial diversity of the mainstream environmental movement. That means both NGOs, foundations, and government agencies. Because when you look across the movement, you're gonna see a few things. And one of the things you gotta think about is, okay, you have these local people and communities, as Teresa mentioned, but how are they reflected in leadership? Are they reflected in leadership? And are the decisions that are actually getting made include not only their authentic voices, but them as actual decision makers in the process? And Green 2.0 is really thinking of how do you take a campaign style approach to change that? So how do you really take a concerted, focused effort to say, all right, the leadership at these organizations also need to reflect the values, the ethics, the legality, the voice of people with different perspectives. So that's sort of our mission. And what I'm gonna do, I'm usually a storyteller, but I'm gonna go with statistics today because it's sort of the more stark and really resonates. So when you think about the leadership at these major environmental NGOs, and I mean sort of the big, both national and international green groups, as we call them, at foundations and at government agencies, here are the statistics for interns, for staff, for leadership, and at boards. And what you can see is, generally speaking, you don't crack beyond 15% of their staff that are people of color. Rarely, if it happens at all. And usually at the board seats, the closest you're gonna get maybe is 14% of the board. When you look at the current US workforce, people of color are approximately 35%. So there's clearly a disconnect going on here, which is what's happening to the movement and why are people of color not showing up in both jobs and on board seats to add their voice, their perspective to this movement. And so this wonderful infographic is a result of a report that was done in 2014 by Green 2.0, which is say, all right, what is our current baseline? Where are we? And then our goal over time is to actually change that baseline so that you can see, hopefully over the next 4 or 5 years, a substantial change in those numbers. So the infographic, I hope, in a few years is gonna look different than this. But my real hope is that the outcomes, solutions, and problems that we're dealing with are more holistic. And this gets back to Mustafa and Teresa's point. So how are we actually looking at this full picture? What does it actually look like? Are we talking about clean air, clean water, food? Those 3 basic things are still problems in the US. I mean, just look at places like Flint, Michigan. Perfect example. Why is that still happening? Why is it still happening to a community of color? What are the implications when leadership doesn't reflect that community or has their best interests when pushing forward advancing issues? If somebody from Flint isn't in that room, isn't at that board seat, what happens? I think we know. So the question is, how do you really start changing that so that those people actually have a seat at the table? The other way that we're really trying to think about this is, all right, we've got a baseline, now how do we continue the march towards progress? Which is, all right, what does an organization do around collecting its diversity data? What's the diversity data currently of your staff and board? And this means along racial lines, gender lines, sexual orientation, disabilities. Do you collect that data? Then B, share it publicly. And to date, and hopefully I've got a deadline coming in a few weeks, about 66% of the major, I mean sort of the top 50 environmental organizations have shared their data publicly. Huge accomplishment, huge transformation in a couple of years, just getting them to share that data. The question now is, all right, what are you doing internally on diversity, equity, and inclusion in your work, both at the staff level, but also at the programmatic level? And both of those things need to happen. Because it's great if you even bring people in the door, but they have to want to stay, they want to have to do the work, and they want to continue to do the work so that I hopefully see them in 10 years, not so they leave in 3. And realize that these people are going to want it, some of them are going to want to do the environmental justice work. But some people like me, when I started off this work, want to do just the programmatic work in oceans, which is what I did. But I was also the only person of color who ever showed up in a room. Why is that? What does that mean for me walking into that room? What does that mean for every staffer who walks into that room? And how do you both support that person, advance them, and show that that perspective or that uniqueness that they're bringing adds value? The other place is around foundations. They're obviously a great source of funding for a lot of these mainstream environmental groups. And they are often a closed club in a lot of respects, just like the environmental movement is, which is who's sitting at those tables, who's making the decisions on where those grant funds go and where they go and who they benefit. And another tactic we're taking, which is, all right, what's the diversity data of your staff as a foundation? What does that look like? How does that impact the grants that you give and the programmatic work that you measure and track? And to date, only about 24% of the foundations have submitted their diversity data. We'll continue that push.